When you are debugging, you need to see the information stored in variables and other objects in your code. Data tips and data visualizers are provided by Visual Studio to show you this information. In this video, I'll look at the data tips, which are floating tooltips which display the value of the variables. I'll open a few files before I start debugging. And then I'll attach the debugger and click on this button. If you've watched other videos in this chapter, you've seen me use breakpoints. Line 34 shows you another way of adding a breakpoint to your code. This is a programmatic way of adding a breakpoint. I'm making a call to system.diagnostics.debugger.break. Before I do that, I make sure and check to see if I have a debugger attached. I'm doing that on line 32. At this point, I'm ready to step through my code and show you the data tips. To step through my code, I can use a keystroke. I can use either F10 or F11. Both of them will work. At this point, I've stepped through several lines in my application, and I've loaded several of my variables with information. To see a data tip, I hover over the variable. That is a data tip. It's showing me that this string value says one word after another. I'll do the same thing for this tax rate variable. When you're working with types that have more properties, like my tour class, this is a class that I wrote, it has several properties on it. When I hover over the variable and look at the data tip, you'll see there's a small triangle on the left side of the screen. When I hover over that, I get the extra information that's embedded inside that type. This also works with this birth date variable, which is of date time. Data tips are useful for showing you lists of information. This next example uses the sorted dictionary class. If you haven't seen this type before, it's a list, but every item that you add to the list is kept in alphabetic order based on this string value here, this key. Now at this point, I have 3 items in my dictionary. So when I look at the data tip, I'll see the contents of that dictionary are shown here. Each of the line items is listed here. And when I drill down even further, I can see more information about Betsy or about Henry. You'll notice that they're in alphabetic order by the key. That implies that if I add Freddie here, it'll rearrange the information inside the sorted dictionary, which is exactly what it's doing. There are other actions you can perform with a data tip. It has a context menu. To activate the context menu, you need to right-click on the data tip, not right-click on the variable. So let's look at this tour information up here. If I right-click on the tour variable, I get this large menu. This is not the context menu we're looking for. You want to right-click on the data tip, like this. This context menu gives me several additional things I can do with the data that's in the data tip. I can copy it, I can edit the values, I can add some watch windows and some other things. Now you can do that from this menu, but I find it easier if I pin the data tip. So to pin the data tip, hover over it, and then move to the right edge of the data tip where there's this picture of a stick pin. Click on that to pin the data tip. This data tip is affiliated with this code window, and it's a movable item. I can drag this around any location that I want inside my code window. If I have more than one tip, let's say I want to use the sorted names, hover over it and click on the stick pin. Now I've got 2 of these data tips in here. To close the data tip, click on the X button. This data tip is affiliated with this code window. That means if I switch over to this text window, you will not see the data tip, which makes sense. Usually you want the data tips located in the code that you're editing. But if you ever want to have a floating tooltip that floats over all your code editors, you can do that too. Go here and click on the stick pin next to the pinned data tip. And now it changes color. It's yellow. That signifies it's floating over all the windows. So if I go to this text file, you'll see it's floating there, and return back here, it's still floating. Let's repin it. I'd like to copy some of the data. Now, if I just copy the tour class, you might not get what you expect. I'll copy this. I'll move over to this paste here text file and paste this in. That's not really what I was expecting. I was hoping to get the data that's inside the instance of the type, not the type name itself. So what did I do wrong? Well, I didn't drill deep enough into the tour instance. I need to click on this plus symbol and then copy this item here. And I can also, if you notice, I can click on the end of where it says location, and there's another pin button here. So this will add this property to my data tip. See that? So now tour.location is part of my data tip. Now I'll right click on this and choose copy, return over here. And you see that I get the name of the property and the value that's stored in there. If I choose to copy the expression, then I get just the expression portion of that data. And if I choose to copy the value, I'll just get the value portion of it. I can also add. Look at this. I can choose add expression here. So I'd like to, instead of having multiple data tips, I'd like to keep them all in one location. I'd like to add the birth date and the sorted names here. So I'll choose add expression, sorted names. And now this data tip has tour, tour.location, birth date, and sorted names. And if I move the data tip, they all move together. You can change the value. I'll change this value here for tour.location. So I just click here and type in a new value. Keep an eye on it. You see what happened? Visual Studio uses the color red to signify which of the data items inside the data tip has just changed. This is the most recent change, is the one that's in red. Now if you hover over the data over here, you'll see that that is in fact changed. This data tip is persisted if I restart my debugging session. Let me stop debugging and then restart debugging. And you'll see my data tips where I left it. And if you really want to keep this data tip around, you can even export this information and reuse it. I can take that data tip and give it to another developer, or I can reload it into another copy of Visual Studio. It's pretty easy to do. Go up to the debug menu and choose Export Data Tips. And then you'll give your XML file a name. And later when you want to bring the data tips into your project, just choose Debug, Import Data Tips.